Hello and welcome back to Oversky Deck Doctor. This week we're going to take a look at mono green. I've noticed recently that Yellow Rush has been running rampant on the ladder, so I decided to build a mono green deck in order to counter these Yellow Rushes, and I've had great success with this so far. I've only lost a couple of games to Yellow Rush where I just situations I couldn't control, but I also had to refine this list to counter other decks that were cropping up the ladder, like Green Yellow Sacrifice. That seems to be a deck that other players are using to counter the Yellow Rush, and that's why something like Voice of Truth has made it into this list. Not only does it help against Zealous Crusaders, but it also helps against Soul Eaters. So if you're having trouble against Rush on ladder, this might be the deck for you. Lots of taunts, big creatures, healing, and a way to sustain yourself until you can finally teleport a creature up to your opponent's orb and finish them off. So let's go over the deck list and take a look at the cards. Our first selection of cards are the early game creatures. You want to find these in your opening hand to start harvesting Faeria. Living Willow, fantastic taunt creature for Yellow Rush. This absolutely terrorizes Yellow Rush because a lot of their haste creatures only have one life, and it's a 1/7. It's really annoying to get rid of. It usually demands a couple of pieces of removal and can be a big problem for your opponent to deal with, but also it's a great source of economy for mono green. You can use Feed the Forest on this, get a burst of Faeria and draw a card. So just a great card overall, but against Yellow Rush it's fantastic because it stops those weenie little hasters, and you can get some Faeria back from the Feed the Forest combo. Wood Elemental, another taunt creature that develops an additional forest. We do run Faeria Golem in this list, so we need to get 5 forests down in order to play that, and the Feed the Forest since it's changed. So yeah, just another taunt. It's a 2/4, not as durable as the Living Willow, but you gain that additional forest, which is incredibly valuable. Verdant Force, now you may think, oh, why would I want to play this early? It's simply because it's a turn 2 play. You'll have 6 Faeria, 2 forests, you can get this guy down, and you can start harvesting Faeria. As a 7/7, it's quite a big creature, so it can challenge stuff like the Shaitan Demon, for example, or the Lord of the Wastes. But it doesn't have a lot of life, which is a little unfortunate, but this is the type of card you want to teleport up to your opponent's orb at the end of the game and smack them in the face until they're dead. So Verdant Force is very powerful in that respect, but it's also very good in non-Yellow Rush matches, where you maybe have to fight for control for Wells, and a 7/7 is a fantastic stat line for that type of creature. It's going to be able to kill a lot of stuff, including stuff like Groundshaker, Oversky Towship, and many, many more. So Verdant Force, no text, but a very solid creature. Up next, we have your mid-game creatures. These creatures demand 3 special lands or 3 forests to get going. So you're going to be playing these after turn 3 or maybe a little bit later, depending on what you do with your land. Grove Guardian is a taunt, 5/6, great stat line for 5 Faeria. And the taunt keyword is very valuable, especially when defending against Yellow Rush. And this creature can challenge a lot of popular bulky creatures from the Yellow Rush, like Shaitan Demons, Lord of the Waste, Demon Wings. So a great taunt creature, and just a very efficient creature for its cost of 5/6 for 5 Faeria. It's absolutely fantastic. Runin is a great creature against Yellow Rush as well, because when it dies, it goes back to your hand and they don't really have an answer to it. It can keep going down every turn as long as you've got the Faeria. It's actually a great card against anything without Swallow and Transform. So if you're going against a red deck, they're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with Runin as it keeps getting bigger and keeps getting resummoned. So Runin, just a fantastic creature overall, as long as it doesn't get transformed. But even then, if your opponent invests any transformation into Runin, that's a Frogify not going on your Faeria Golem or your Verdant Force, so you don't mind that much. But just a great creature in general. Ancient Boar, one of the new additions to mono green thanks to its recent change. It's more flexible now in its wildline cost, but it's just a little cheaper as well. So a 5 Faeria 4/5 with dash 2. If you control a creature with 5 life or more, which is not hard in this list, it costs 3 Faeria. And this is a very good creature for holding the board with, especially against Yellow Rush, because it's cheap. And you can dash it in front of your opponent's haste path. So if you can dash onto the deserts as well to stop them from summoning creatures here for that turn. And at 3 Faeria for a 4/5, this is going to trade off with Shaitan Demon for the same Faeria value. It can kill Demon Wings, it can take 2-for-1s on haste creatures. Very fantastic creature against Yellow Rush. Next, we'll take a look at some of the later game cards. We have Sagami Grovecaller. It's part of your win condition against Yellow Rush, being able to teleport a creature up to their orb and start dealing some damage. It can be used in the mid game if you're playing against another archetype, just to move your creatures around. Maybe take favourable clears on your opponent's creatures that are out of reach. But it does have a steep land requirement, and you do need lands in the correct positions if you want to get the most out of the teleport. Now, Faeria Golem is 5 forest, very, very bulky creature, 5/10, very difficult to deal with, especially for Yellow Rush, which aren't really running Last Nightmare at the moment. So you might get away with Faeria Golem sticking around for a few turns and just clearing everything that the Yellow Rush player uses. And this can be comboed with Feed the Forest for a massive Faeria burst. And both of these cards now require 5 forests, so you're going to see them around the same time. And don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to feed a Faeria Golem to get an extra card, get more Faeria, and be able to play 2 creatures. One of the things I've done in the past is just play Faeria Golem, feed it, and then play Verdant Force Grove Guardian over just one Faeria Golem. The more creatures, the better when you're fighting against Yellow Rush. Now, Feed the Forest, which just mentioned, great card to get a burst of economy. You get additional Faeria based off the creature's life, and you draw a card. So prime targets for this are Living Willow, Faeria Golem, but you can also use it on Sagami Grovecaller, the Wood Elemental, anything with high life really. I'd avoid using it on stuff like Grove Guardian and Verdant Force unless you really need to. But there's one thing Feed the Forest can do, it can give you lethal opportunities. So if you have 2 creatures in a row going towards your opponent's orb, and they block you from shifting your creatures around the orb to hit, you can hit first with the first creature in front, feed it, and then move forward and find the lethal. So that's one of the cool tricks you can do with Feed the Forest. Last but not least, we have the utility cards. Runin's Guidance is a cheap power-up, but also a 5 life burst of healing. This can be very valuable against Rush, being able to top your health up, just put them out of reach while you regather your forces to defend. But I also included this because I was seeing a little bit of burn about, and I figured, you know, this is a power-up, so we can use it for that anyway. And if we do encounter a burn matchup, we have a form of healing, and burn hates healing. Healing really tips burn out of favor because they usually don't have enough damage to push through, especially if they're under a lot of pressure. So Runin's Guidance, kind of 2 uses there, a power-up and healing against certain matchups. Now, Elderwood Embrace just gives a very high life stat and a 2 attack as well. This is really good on a taunt creature, extending its life even further to make sure that Yellow Rush player can't keep chipping away at you. So if you use this on Living Willow, it's not that good because it can still be Choking Sands, but on Wood Elemental, it pushes its way outside of the reach of Choking Sand and pumps up to a 4/8. So Elderwood Embrace on Wood Elemental is very good if you want to play around Choking Sands. That's one of its fine uses, but you can also use this on other creatures if you just want to give them more life or more power to deal with any threats. Last but not least is the Voice of Truth, another great Feed the Forest target, but also a fantastic gift ability in dealing with Zealous Crusaders. Now this will reset a Zealous Crusader back to a 3/3, and it'll be much easier to manage rather than the 10/10 Zealous Crusaders we're seeing at the moment because of cards like Flash Salmon, which gives an additional hit that Yellow Rush didn't really have before the Oversky. So Voice of Truth, very good against Zealous Crusaders. You can also heal your own creatures back to their original stat lines. So let's say you hit into a Demon Wing with your Verdant Force. Your Verdant Force has 2 life left, very vulnerable to Soul Drain. You can use the Voice of Truth to top back up to a 7/7 and make it more awkward for your opponent. Now, if you do run into Green-Yellow Sacrifice, this can be a very good way to manage Bone Collectors and the Soul Eaters. I did bump into a few of them yesterday, so I did add that to help against that. But also, it does deal with the Zealous Crusaders. And that's mainly Voice of Truth's use, to either reset your own creature's life after it's taken damage, or bring down a big creature that's been powered up some way back to its original size. That wraps up the deck list. Let's take a look at the Mulligan. As I said earlier, you want to find a creature you can play early. Living Willow, Wood Elemental, and Verdant Force all satisfy that need. Although I would say Living Willow and Wood Elemental the better two to find, especially Wood Elemental, because you can get your Forest Acceleration down early. Willow's really bulky, so it probably won't die, so it's a very durable creature to keep on board and collect Faeria. But Verdant Force is just an alternative to those two if you don't find them. And Verdant Force is not that bad, like I said. If you're playing against a non-rush deck, it can be very handy when fighting for well control. Now, if you do find one of these creatures, you can look for, say, a power-up like Elderwood Embrace or Runin's Guidance to help your creatures fight on board. Grove Guardian's a good alternative as well. If you need a taunt and you can get to free forest quite quickly, especially with the Wood Elemental, Grove Guardian's also a great keep, and it has a great stat line. And the Boar as well, the Ancient Boar, is also a great keep if you can get to those free forests. You know, it's a very cheap creature that can dash into a defensive or maybe offensive position if you need it to, and only 3 special lands as well, so the Wood Elemental definitely complements keeping those cards. And yeah, that's mainly what you want to do. You want to find yourself an early collector, and then you want to find some cards to support it while you're fighting on board. Now we've seen all the deck, how much does it cost? It costs 840 Memoria, with 12 commons, 15 rares, 2 epics, and 1 legendary. Very, very cheap. Now, take into consideration that Runing costs 320 Memoria on its own. You can actually get this deck list down even cheaper to the 520 Memoria range. And you could easily replace Runing for another Faeria Golem. We're only running 2 because we have to make room for the Voice of Truth. So if you do need to bring down the price even more, just drop the Runing for now until you can pick it up and add that additional Faeria Golem. Now, one thing to consider as well, that this deck runs no Oversky cards. So these are all cards from the core set. We wanted to get a lot of taunts in here, so we didn't really have room for stuff like Crystal Flowers and stuff like that. So yeah, very cheap deck list. Very good for beginners as well. Mono Green is a great learning tool for Faeria, so I'd strongly recommend you trying this list out if you are new to the game. It teaches you stuff like land placement, creature combat, and positioning, which are all very key fundamentals of Faeria. Up next, we have the strengths and weaknesses. Taunt creatures. This is very good in a meta game with a lot of rush. So you have access to some of the most powerful taunts in Faeria, and this is going to help you when defending against those pesky hasters. Bulky creatures with high life. This can be very valuable in certain matchups, especially when you're fighting on board. Faeria Golems are an absolute nightmare to deal with if your opponent has to deal with them honestly through creature combat, or just using damage-based removal like red. Very annoying creature to answer. And you have ways to increase the life of your creatures through the power-ups, and also reset their stats once they've taken damage. So these creatures are very hard to deal with outside of using hard removal, transform effects, and swallow. Strong utility, there's healing in this deck, you've got teleport, and you've got Faeria ramp through the Feed the Forest combo. So lots of different tools you can use in this mono green list to help you win your matches. As for weaknesses, struggles against greedier decks. So one of the problems I found when I'm playing this, if my opponent had a greedy deck like a blue-red tortoise deck, or maybe a green-yellow sacrifice deck, I had to be the aggressor rather than playing the passively, because those decks have a better win condition in a very slow matchup. So at that point, you need to start developing forests towards your opponent and start trying to beat them down, whereas this deck's more designed to defend rather than be offensive. So the greedier decks are going to be a bit of a struggle. They're not unwinnable, it just means you have to play differently and you have to play far more aggressively. Relies heavily on Feed the Forest to make a comeback. So Feed the Forest, there's so many times I've played mono green where I'm just like, if I draw Feed the Forest, I'm going to be absolutely fine. And I draw in my cards every turn and I'm not finding Feed the Forest, and then I'm not fine at all. So Feed the Forest is a huge component of mono green. It's so valuable. It's a way for you to get back into a match. If you can, say, drop a Willow and feed it, that could be a way for you to play a Faeria Golem or a Verdant Force or a Grove Guardian and get back on board. But the creatures, the smaller creatures like Living Willow and the Wood Elemental, not very good at defending big creatures like Ground Shakers and other green creatures. So you need that burst of Faeria if you're behind in order to set up a good defense. So deck does rely on Feed the Forest quite a lot, but most decks which have used this in the past have relied on it anyway for comeback. It is a great comeback mechanic, but if you don't see it, it's going to be very hard to make those comebacks in those matches where you're falling behind. last but not least, let's take a look at land placement. Now I'm going to split this into two parts. First, we're going to look at anti-rush land placement, and then we're going to look at just normal land placement against any deck that isn't rushing you down. So for anti-rush, it's very simple. You just build lands from the side of your orb. You make sure you get those well spots so they don't get any additional Faeria when they summon the haste creatures, and then you just defend from that region. Now, that's very simple for you to do because you have a lot of taunt creatures. You can just keep slamming down taunt creatures, answering their threats, and just basically hold out until a very key moment in the matchup comes up. And that is when you finally, when you have some breathing room, so when your opponent maybe doesn't have a play or they just pass and don't do anything, you start developing lands up towards your opponent. And the way I like to do this is I like to build a forest on one of the sides of their stream of lands coming down, and then you go double neutral, and then you go forest again, and this will set up a teleport for you later on. Teleport can be used defensively. Sometimes it may have to be if you need to move a creature to the other side of your orb to take care of a haste creature, but it is going to be a primary win condition. And you can also summon creatures up here yourself if you feel like you've fended off the rush for a turn, you have a bit of breathing room. That could be an opportune moment to, say, drop a Version Force up there to start winning the game. So you can't really win by just sitting back all the time. Sometimes you can, I have done it, but you do need to be proactive at some point, and picking those moments are going to be very important. Usually, I'd go for it when you feel like you've stabilized. So maybe you have two creatures on board, your opponent has no Faeria, and they pass, and then you're like, right, this is the moment you can summon something aggressive and start pushing damage. Now, if you're not playing against Rush, there is another way you can build land. I like to build from the one side of my orb and go straight up. Now, this is the more aggressive line. So I was talking about in the strengths and weaknesses that you will struggle against greedier decks. So what you need to do against these decks is build straight up. Just completely dodge the inner wells and get as many big creatures as you can up there to start applying pressure. Now, if you're playing in a match against, say, another mid-range deck like Red Combat or Green-Red Crackthorn, you want to go into the wells. You have a lot of high life creatures, so holding the wells are going to be much easier for you, especially against a red deck, because they have to pump so much damage-based removal into your creatures. And then you can go into the wells and start double collecting and start fighting for well control. And that kind of wraps it up. So against anti-rush, build both sides of your orb and collect off your own wells. Find that opportunity to make an aggressive line near their orb, use teleportation or summon the creature up there to start applying pressure. If you're playing against a greedy deck, go straight up past the inner wells and try and get an aggressive land up there as quickly as possible to start summoning creatures to apply pressure. And if you're fighting against another mid-range deck or another deck that relies on well control, get in those wells, start fending them off and take control of them. That wraps up this episode of Oversky Deck Doctor. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you are playing against a lot of Yellow Rush, I'd recommend giving this deck list a go. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, drop a subscribe to keep up to date of when our content goes live. Be sure to check out some of our other videos. If you're new to the channel, we have other episodes of Deck Doctor. Last week we had a green-blue ramp, and it was also very cheap to craft. So a great deck to give it a go if you're new to Faeria and you want to use your Memoria wisely. You can also check out this week's card Spotlight as well, where I cover the Twin Soul Spirits and play some spicy decks on the ladder. So until next time, guys, take care. And I hope you enjoy Mono Green Anti-Rush.